Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes a staggering $315 trillion, a number 3 times the size of the global economy. This debt is often presented as a solvable problem, an economic misfortune, a political failure. But here is the paradox that should terrify you. If everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? When you follow the chain of creditors, when you track who actually holds the debt, you discover something deeply disturbing. The world does not owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. This reality is not an accident. It is the result of a deliberate, centuries-long design. 4 men, 4 financial architects across 3 centuries built a system where debt can never be repaid. They created a structure where governments must borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward, and where the people who designed the trap profit from every payment, every crisis, and every bailout. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The meetings happened, the contracts exist, and the mechanisms are public record. Once you see how they built it, you will understand why $38 trillion is not a problem to be solved. It is the system working exactly as designed. We will show you the 4 architects, the 4 moments when the debt trap was engineered, and why every government on Earth is now caught inside it with no way out. Before 1694, kings borrowed money the old way. They would go to merchants or nobles and promise repayment with interest. If they could not pay, they would default. Creditors lost money, kings borrowed from someone else. It was risky for lenders and embarrassing for kings. But the system was contained. Debt was temporary, either repaid or defaulted, and the books were cleared. William Patterson changed everything. He was a Scottish merchant and financial schemer who, after multiple failures, had an idea that would fundamentally reshape civilization. In 1691, England was at war with France. King William III desperately needed money. The treasury was empty, and traditional lenders were refusing new loans due to England's poor repayment record. Patterson's idea was brilliant and sinister. A group of investors would lend the king £1.2 million at 8% interest. In exchange for this loan, the king would grant the investors the right to form the Bank of England. The bank would not only handle the government's finances, but critically, it was granted the right to issue currency. This established the toxic template that defines modern finance. The government borrows money, never repays the principal, pays interest forever, and the debt itself, the government bond, becomes the backing for the nation's currency. The loan was not a temporary solution, it was a permanent liability that became the engine of the money supply. This system is catastrophic for the taxpayer, who is perpetually paying interest on debt that will never disappear. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. Patterson's innovation was the crucial first step. He made debt permanent. The debt trap was set in 1694, and every government since has walked into it willingly. By the early 1800s, European governments had fully embraced debt. They borrowed for wars, infrastructure, and operating expenses. But the market was disorganized. Each loan was negotiated individually. Interest rates varied wildly, and only the wealthiest merchants could participate. Nathan Rothschild changed that. He industrialized sovereign debt. The Rothschild family had started as money changers in Frankfurt. By controlling information and market timing, the family established a powerful model. Control the issuance, control the information, and control the market. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt. If a government needed to borrow, they went through the Rothschilds because the family controlled the network of investors and set the terms. They used private couriers and carrier pigeons to move financial intelligence faster than any government, gaining a critical edge, famously at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Before Rothschild, governments could, theoretically, refuse to pay. If a king defaulted, his creditors lost money and the system reset. But Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across borders. A British bond might be owned by a French investor who sold it to a German bank who used it as collateral for a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting was no longer just refusing one creditor. It meant collapsing an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make debt so interconnected that default becomes impossible. Governments were now trapped. They had to keep paying, and they had to keep borrowing to pay the interest on old debts. The debt trap was no longer just permanent, it was inescapable. The Rothschild family wealth peaked in the mid-1800s. They were the richest family in the world. This wealth came solely from interest on sovereign debt. They didn't produce anything or build anything. They simply lent money to governments and collected interest forever. The system Patterson created was now industrialized by Rothschild, and every government was caught. By 1900, America was an economic powerhouse, yet it still operated with a primitive financial system. The money supply was tied to gold, and there was no central mechanism to manage debt. This led to frequent, violent financial panics. The crisis came in 1907. Stock prices crashed, banks failed, and the economy seized up. J.P. Morgan fixed the problem, not for the public good, but to protect his own vast banking empire. He gathered the country's leading financiers in his library, locked the doors, and forced them to audit the collapsing banks. Morgan and his associates decided who would be saved and who would be allowed to fail. Without a central authority, the nation relied on a private rescue. This crisis convinced lawmakers that a central bank was necessary. In 1910, in extreme secrecy on Jekyll Island, a group of powerful bankers, including representatives from Morgan's firm, drafted the blueprint for the Federal Reserve. The public was told the Fed was for stability, but the men who wrote the law were protecting their own interests. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created a system where private banks controlled the money supply, and the Federal Reserve acted as the lender of last resort. When World War I hit, the real genius of the Fed emerged. Without the Federal Reserve, the government could not have borrowed at the massive scale required to fund the war. The market alone would not support it. But with the Fed as a guaranteed buyer of government debt, there was effectively no limit. The Fed could print money to buy the bonds that funded the war, leading to a seamless loop of borrowing, spending, and production. The debt trap, already permanent and inescapable, now became infinite. Morgan's mechanism ensured that the government could borrow trillions without fear of market collapse, simply because the entity created to manage debt could print the money to absorb it. By the 1970s, the debt trap built by Patterson, Rothschild, and Morgan was functioning globally. Every developed nation borrowed, rolled over debt, and paid interest. But developing nations were different. They borrowed for infrastructure, and many could not keep up payments. The debt trap was reaching its limits. Then came Paul Volcker, who served as the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 1970s and 80s, and his policy legacy secured the inescapability of global debt. When countries began defaulting, institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, an entity created to ensure financial soundness, stepped in.
The IMF offered loans to these struggling nations, but with brutal strings attached. This playbook included austerity measures, cutting public spending, raising taxes, privatizing assets, and devaluing currency. The country received temporary relief, but its economy shrank, making repayment harder. It was forced to continue borrowing to pay the interest on the original debt. This meant nations had to surrender political and economic sovereignty in exchange for the privilege of staying in debt. This pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001, and again today, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time, the structure is the same. IMF loans keep paying interest, austerity is imposed, sovereignty is surrendered, and the debt is never eliminated. It is only restructured and made perpetual. Volcker's legacy is the mechanism that ensures the debt trap is global and universally inescapable. Even when countries cannot pay, they are not allowed to default. They are refinanced into permanent indebtedness. The interest keeps flowing to the creditors, the same banks and institutions.
The four architects, Patterson, Rothschild, Morgan, and Volcker, built a system where debt is the foundation of power. This structure ensures workers pay, institutions collect, and the debt never decreases. Now, the system is rapidly evolving, integrating the financial trap with a digital surveillance grid. This is the architecture of inescapability. 1. The digital panopticon. The modern control system has moved beyond physical coercion. It is now a post-panopticon. Individuals willingly contribute to their own permanent, unavoidable digital surveillance by leaving extensive digital traces, participatory surveillance. This permanent digital persona risks their future opportunities. The technological trajectory points toward a geo-AI singularity, where everything on Earth will be constantly monitored and analyzed by AI. Algorithmic agency. The AI systems built by algorithmic designers are not neutral tools. They operate as active agents of control, prioritizing metrics like efficiency and profit maximization over ethics, leading to the normalization of ubiquitous surveillance. The CBDC nexus. The ultimate tool for enforcement is the central bank digital currency, CBDC. This technology merges the centralized control of monetary policy with pervasive digital monitoring. CBDCs inherently raise profound challenges concerning financial privacy. With programmable money, authorities could potentially enforce negative interest rates directly, restrict how money is spent, or even expire savings to force consumption. CBDCs give the institutional designers the ability to manage the perpetual debt system through total control over digital cash. The technology, designed for efficiency, risks being weaponized against citizens to enforce social control, as warned by the ECNY model. The system operates like the Hindu philosophical concept of Maya, a veil or glamour that prevents people from perceiving the true reality. The modern system manufactures a compelling material reality, defined by consumerism, efficiency, and mandatory participation. Escaping this trap would require a dramatic reduction in material welfare that the global population is unwilling to accept. The economic price of autonomy is too high. The system's inescapability rests on this functional paradox. It is maintained by a structural flaw, debt-based money requiring perpetual growth, enforced by a permanent digital persona, and defended by powerful institutions that always protect the system over the individual. The ultimate threat is the convergence of debt and digital control. History teaches that financial freedom requires more than income. It requires leverage and control. The only defense against the system's crushing weight is awareness. Resistance begins with recognizing the illusion. You cannot stop the entire structure, but you can build your own resilience outside its traps by holding real assets, land, commodities, skills, and embracing the Stoic philosophy of mastering your desires. The architects knew that debt isn't a problem, it's the foundation, and interest is the rent we pay to live in their system.